Hey friends, thank you for being here tonight. Whether you're a returning listener or just stumbled in looking for peace and a good story, I'm glad you've joined me. We're heading back to ancient Greece, not for the usual gods and greatest hits, but for the deep cuts, the hidden gems barely visible behind Hercules' abnormally big biceps and Achilles' crowd of simps. You've heard of the legends everyone talks about, but what about the hero who fought a sea monster and still had time to argue with his in-laws? Or the one who saved a whole city and got paid in slightly nicer sandals? These are the stories of the unsung, the bold, the brilliant, and sometimes the bewildered, and I promise they're just as grand, just as moving, and maybe even more human than the names carved into temple walls. Before we begin, if you enjoy what I do, if these tales help you wind down, escape, or just feel a little more connected, please hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. It really helps keep this going, not to mention goodwill from the algorithmic fates. And drop a comment too. Tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is when you join me. I'd love hearing from you, but enough of that. Now take a deep breath, get cozy, listen to the lyre slowly fade into the Aegean, and let these ancient tales carry you into your own journey. You've earned this rest, and I've got a story or two to tell you. In ancient Greece, kingship wasn't all feasting and royal decrees. Sometimes it meant dealing with the unpredictable whims of the gods, the constant threat of war, and occasionally having to get into family squabbles that would make even the gods wince. One such king was Menelaus, the ruler of Sparta, whose life would be a series of dramatic events, most notably marked by a certain woman, Helen of Troy, and her notorious habit of running off. Now Menelaus didn't start out as the most famous king in Greece. Sure, he had a pretty decent kingdom, a few fine horses, and the good fortune of being a member of the powerful Atreus family, but that's not exactly the kind of resume that makes you a household name in Greek mythology. His brother Agamemnon, on the other hand, was a much bigger deal. A commander in the Trojan War, a man who, well, was just better at making a scene. But Menelaus had his own claim to fame, Helen. Now Helen wasn't just any woman. She was said to be the most beautiful mortal, and maybe immortal, woman in all of Greece, and she had no shortage of suitors. In fact, when she came of age, her father, Tyndareus, the king of Sparta, was faced with the kind of problem that would make any parent reach for the nearest bottle of wine. Every eligible bachelor wanted to marry her. To avoid a bloodbath, because, let's be real, some of these suitors were basically ready to kill each other, just to get a shot at Helen, Tyndareus came up with a plan. He asked for a solemn oath from all of Helen's suitors to support the man who would win her hand no matter what. This way, no one could claim favoritism or start a war because the worst-case scenario would involve everyone just teaming up to deal with any future issues. Of course, when Helen picked Menelaus, he wasn't exactly expecting a perfect marriage. After all, who can predict that your wife would eventually run off with the Prince of Troy? If Menelaus had known, he might have just kept things strictly business, the kingdom, the alliances, and maybe a little less romance. But as it goes in mythology, Menelaus got stuck with a tragic hero role. A king who got a lovely wife, an unexpected war, and a chance to become famous for all the wrong reasons. So Menelaus' fate was sealed. He married Helen, enjoyed a bit of royal bliss, and then the Trojan War happened. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before all that drama, he was just a regular guy, doing regular king things until his wife decided to go on a rather unusual adventure. But for all the honour bestowed upon him, there were moments when his name carried a deeper, more bittersweet tone. His death had served as the spark that ignited the battle, and while the Greeks had ultimately triumphed, it was a triumph that had cost them so much. It was a victory marred by the death of one of their finest leaders, the first of many who would fall in the pursuit of glory. Though Achilles, Odysseus, and others would take their places in the annals of history, Protesilaus' story never lost its power. His legend was more than just the tale of a fallen hero. It was a story of a man who had given everything to honour his people, to protect his comrades, and to fulfil his duty, even when he knew it would cost him his life. His death, which seemed like an inevitability, had shaped the course of the war and the lives of the men who had fought beside him. He had stood on the shores of Troy with courage, faced death with honour, and accepted his fate without hesitation. It was said that even the gods had taken notice of the man who'd been willing to die for his people. While Zeus and the other deities had their own agendas, Protesilaus' story became one that was woven into the very fabric of fate. In some versions of the myth, it was believed that his spirit had not fully left the mortal realm. Some claimed that Protesilaus could still be seen in the wind or heard in the crashing waves of the sea, his restless spirit continuing its journey even after his body had fallen. His legacy was not just written in stone, in the songs sung by bards, or in the festivals held in his honour. It was in the quiet, reflective moments of the warriors who came after him. Every soldier who went to war, every hero who took up arms in the name of duty, would think of Protesilaus and remember what he had given. He was the first, yes, but his sacrifice had paved the way for the others who followed. It was the ultimate act of heroism, to give all, knowing that the gods might demand the cost of your life. Protesilaus' story, though tragic, was one that the Greeks held dear in their hearts. They did not see him as a man whose death had been pointless, nor as a casualty of war who had fallen in vain. Instead, they saw him as a symbol of duty, of sacrifice, and of the unyielding will of the human spirit. For the Greeks, Protesilaus was not just a name. He was a reminder that even in death there could be honour, and that even the first to fall could leave behind a legacy that would outlast the war itself. As the songs of the Trojan War were passed down from generation to generation, so too was the memory of Protesilaus. His sacrifice was enshrined not only in the history of Greece, but in the very hearts of those who remembered him. And though the passage of time would obscure the faces of many heroes, Protesilaus remained eternal. His story, a testament to the unyielding courage of those who fight for honour, even when the price is their life. So here's the thing about marrying the most beautiful woman in the world. It's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you're the man who gets to say, yes, this is my wife, Helen, the one with the face that launched 1,000 ships, which is cool at parties. On the other hand, it means you'll be dealing with a whole lot of people who are either jealous, desperate, or just plain confused about why you managed to pull that off in the first place. At first, Menelaus and Helen enjoyed a nice, peaceful reign over Sparta, and for a while, it seemed like they had the perfect royal marriage. They had everything: wealth, a beautiful palace, even a few children to boot. But as is often the case in Greek mythology, things were not destined to stay quiet for long. Enter Paris, Prince of Troy, who, as the gods would have it, had his own thoughts about Helen's beauty. Now Paris wasn't a bad guy, just a little bit misguided. He was charming, sure, but also a little like the guy at the party who makes way too many flirty comments and then wonders why everyone gets uncomfortable. In this case, Paris had a rather divine reason for thinking he could get away with it. Aphrodite, the goddess of love herself, had promised him Helen's love in exchange for a rather dubious favour. You see, Paris had been asked to judge a beauty contest between 3 goddesses, because gods in Greek mythology just can't have enough drama, and naturally he picked Aphrodite, whose reward was to offer him the love of the most desirable woman in the world, Helen. Well, Paris, being Paris, decided to take her up on the offer. He waltzed into Sparta, laid on the charm, and before you could say blatant betrayal, Helen decided to leave her husband and run off to Troy with him. Talk about a whirlwind romance, right? Now Menelaus, for all his kingly duties, was no fool. He might have been blindsided by the whole thing, but he wasn't about to let a prince from Troy just waltz in and steal his wife, especially not after all the work he'd put into marrying her in the first place. So, after the shock wore off and he took a minute to collect his dignity, Menelaus did what any furious king would do. He called upon the oath of the suitors. Remember that little oath Menelaus' father-in-law Tyndareus made all of Helen's suitors swear? Yeah, the one where they vowed to support Helen's chosen husband against anyone who tried to steal her. Well, Menelaus, now feeling thoroughly betrayed, sent out a summons to all the suitors saying, "Hey, remember that oath you swore to defend my honour? Well, I'm going to need you to back me up on this one." And as you might imagine, Odysseus, Agamemnon, Ajax, and a bunch of other major Greek figures gathered together, all for one thing: to get Helen back and burn Troy to the ground. It was a messy, dramatic situation, but it was exactly the kind of thing that Greek heroes were built for. The Trojan War was on, but Menelaus, as king, and the man at the centre of this war had his own role to play. He wasn't just sitting on the sidelines like some royal figurehead. He led his forces into battle, taking part in major clashes and earning the respect of his fellow warriors. The man who had once been overshadowed by his more famous brother, Agamemnon, now found himself thrust into the limelight, battling not only for his wife's honour, but for the very survival of his kingdom. If there was one thing Menelaus didn't mind, it was proving his worth when the chips were down. Though he wasn't quite as gifted in battle as the likes of Achilles or Diomedes, Menelaus showed his mettle on the battlefield. He fought with determination and courage, though perhaps with slightly more self-preservation than some of his more reckless companions. His leadership was solid, but he wasn't the type to charge headlong into danger without thinking, which, let's be honest, probably saved him a few times. His key moment in the war came during the duel between him and Paris, which was one of the most iconic and dramatic parts of the war. After a tense standoff, the two men faced off in single combat. But as we all know from mythology, when it comes to Paris, things rarely go according to plan. The duel ended in a godly intervention, with Aphrodite swooping in to save Paris at the last moment, whisking him away to safety. Menelaus was furious, but he was also a realist. He knew that in the world of gods, mortals were often pawns in a much bigger game. Menelaus had seen war before. He was no stranger to bloodshed and strategy. But as the Trojan War stretched on year after year, something began to shift inside him. He had been driven by the desire to retrieve his wife, to restore his honour, and to lead the Greeks to victory. But the longer the war dragged on, the more he began to wonder if the prize, Helen, was really worth the price he was paying. After all, what was the point of bringing her back if it meant losing everything else? The Trojan War had consumed them all, but in Menelaus's mind there was always a lingering question. Was Helen truly worth it? He had fought for her honour, had endured countless battles, but in the quiet moments between conflicts, Menelaus began to question everything. Was it all worth it? Was the war just a test of pride and ego, or was there something more at stake? His turning point came not on the battlefield, but in the heat of a fateful moment during one of the most significant duels of the war. It happened during a period of heightened tension, when the Greeks were struggling to breach Troy's towering walls. The gods, who had always been spectators of mortal conflict, were now more involved than ever. Ares, the god of war, took an interest in the conflict, and his divine influence played a part in the bloodshed. In the chaos of one battle, as Menelaus fought valiantly, he found himself face to face with Hector, the Trojan prince. Hector, who had already slain several prominent Greek warriors, was a force to be reckoned with. This was the turning point Menelaus had been waiting for, a chance to finally face the man who had killed so many of his comrades and lay the groundwork for the eventual Greek victory. But as they clashed swords, a strange thought crossed Menelaus's mind. What if this was all futile? The gods, after all, seemed to play as much of a role in their fates as the men themselves. Was the war really about Helen, or was it something much larger, a game for the gods to play with mortal lives? At that moment, Menelaus's resolve began to waver. He fought with all his strength, but it wasn't the same as before. His sword strikes, while powerful, lacked the passion they once had. He was no longer just a man fighting for his wife's return. He was a man fighting because it was the next thing to do, because it was expected of him. As fate would have it, Aphrodite, the goddess of love and the very woman who had set the whole mess in motion by offering Paris Helen's love, intervened at that crucial moment. She appeared out of nowhere, pulling Paris away from the battlefield before Menelaus could strike the fatal blow. Menelaus stood there, sword raised, staring at the empty spot where his enemy had been. The gods had once again meddled in his life, and he could do nothing to change it. In that split second, Menelaus realized that his fight was no longer just with the Trojans. It was with the very gods themselves, with the fate they imposed upon him. Helen, the woman who had started this war, was no longer the central point of his fury. The war had become about proving something, not to the Trojans or to Helen, but to the gods themselves. Menelaus was caught in the middle of a cosmic game, and he began to wonder if there was any real honour to be gained at all. In the aftermath of the duel, the Greeks were victorious in their campaign, but Menelaus couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted within him. He was no longer the eager man who had charged into battle with relentless zeal. The wars of his past, wars driven by pride and a desire for glory, felt like distant memories. He had lost something along the way, and he knew it wasn't just the lives of the men who had died in battle. It was his sense of purpose. The hero's journey, which had seemed so clear when he began, had become muddled, and he began to question the very things that had once motivated him. For Menelaus, this turning point marked the shift from a man who fought for honour and duty to a man who fought simply because it was expected of him. He would continue to lead, continue to fight, but he no longer fought for a cause that felt real to him. He was now just another player in the gods' game, another piece in the ever-turning wheel of fate. After the duel with Paris and the divine interference that thwarted his victory, Menelaus found himself at a crossroads, both as a warrior and as a king. The war had dragged on for so long, and the gods seemed more and more like fickle spectators, pulling strings to ensure that the Greeks and Trojans remained locked in their deadly dance. For Menelaus, the question of what he was truly fighting for became impossible to ignore. With each passing day, the weight of the war grew heavier. The gods, who had once seemed to guide him with divine purpose, now felt more like tormentors. He wasn't simply fighting for Helen anymore. He was fighting to prove something. To the gods, to his fellow warriors, and most of all to himself. But in doing so, he had lost sight of the very reasons he had once gone to war. In his quieter moments, far from the clamour of battle, Menelaus would find himself walking the walls of the Greek camp, lost in thought. The sound of his footsteps was a stark contrast to the chaos of the war around him. What had he gained? The riches of Troy, the glory, the honour, all these things seemed to fade in significance with every step he took toward the inevitable conclusion of the war. What would be left when the dust settled? Would it be worth it? Helen, who had once been the symbol of his victory, had now become a reminder of the futility of it all. Was she truly worth it? In the beginning, he had fought for love, for honour, and for the restoration of his marriage. But as the years of war turned into endless conflict, Menelaus realised something deeply troubling. He had lost himself in the fight. The constant battles, the endless victories and defeats, had transformed him into something he didn't recognise. Was this what he had been promised? The glory of kingship? The triumph of war? Was it worth all the lives that had been lost? One evening, after a particularly brutal day of fighting, Menelaus found himself once again in his tent, staring at his reflection in a bronze shield. The same reflection that had once seemed so proud now seemed weary, as if he had aged years within just a few months. He ran his fingers across the edge of his armour, feeling the weight of his responsibility. "What have I become?" he whispered to himself. Helen entered the tent quietly, her presence startling him for a moment. He had not expected her, though perhaps, after everything they had been through, they had both come to understand that they were bound together by more than just love. They were tied by something darker, fate, duty, and the unrelenting march of time. She looked at him, sensing the turmoil in his eyes. "Menelaus," she said softly, "you have given everything to this war. But does it still make sense to you? All these years, all these battles, what are we fighting for now?" Her question was like a cold breeze sweeping through the tent, but it was a question he had been asking himself in the silence of his mind for so long. What was the point? For a long moment Menelaus didn't answer. He only looked at her, his gaze heavy with the burden of everything they had lost. "I thought I was fighting for us, for you, for Sparta, but now it feels like I'm fighting to hold on to a version of myself that's slipping away." Helen stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I am sorry, Menelaus," she said, her voice full of both regret and sympathy. "I never meant for this, but what's done is done. We can't go back." Menelaus closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the truth in her words. The gods had made their will known, and the war, though it would eventually end, had taken a far greater toll on him than he had ever expected. His internal struggle was no longer about winning or losing the war. It was about finding himself again, about reclaiming the man he had been before all of this had started. The war was not just a battle of armies, it had become a battle of the soul. Menelaus had always prided himself on his strength, his resolve, but now, in the quiet of that moment, he wondered if he had been wrong all along. Had he really been fighting for honour, for glory, Or had he been simply trying to prove something to the gods, to his warriors, and most painfully to himself? As the war continued to rage, Menelaus knew that he would continue to fight. After all, the war was far from over, but now there was something deeper at play. He would face whatever challenges remained with the knowledge that victory, when it came, would not be his alone to claim. It would belong to all those who had fought, suffered, and sacrificed. And yet, despite all the pain and confusion, a small voice in Menelaus's heart told him that perhaps there was something worth fighting for after all, something beyond glory, beyond pride, beyond even Helen. It was the pursuit of peace. It was the hope that one day the endless cycle of war would end, and that maybe, just maybe, he could find himself once more. The war had raged on for what seemed like an eternity. The Trojan War, in all its glory and gore, had drained the spirits of even the greatest heroes. Menelaus, once driven by a singular mission, to retrieve his wife Helen, was now a man struggling to understand the cost of that mission. What had started as a war for love had transformed into something darker, something far beyond his control. The gods, ever meddlesome, had their hands in everything. And with every clash of swords and every fallen hero, Menelaus's understanding of what was truly worth fighting for grew murkier. But there was no going back. Even if his personal conflict clouded his mind, his responsibilities as a king, as a warrior, still held firm. Troy had to fall, and Helen, well, she had to be returned. After all, he couldn't just leave her with Paris and the Trojans, could he? Though he now questioned the ultimate meaning of it all, duty called. Menelaus, despite his inner turmoil, knew there was still a war to be won. It was in the final pivotal moments of the war when Menelaus truly realized the weight of his own hero's journey. The gods, who had been toying with the fates of mortals, were now more involved than ever. Menelaus had already seen enough divine intervention to know that mortal lives were nothing more than pawns in the gods' eternal game. Yet, as the war neared its climax, Menelaus found himself standing in the midst of a battlefield that was no longer about triumph or glory. It was about survival, for his men, for his people, and for the very soul of his kingdom. During one of the most decisive moments of the war, Menelaus led his men into the final assault on the walls of Troy. This was it, the last stand. The gates of Troy had been breached, the Greeks were closing in, and victory was within reach. But even as Menelaus stood at the front of his forces, leading the charge with the same tenacity that had marked his rise to prominence, the weight of the war threatened to crush him. Achilles, now battling at the heart of the conflict, had taken the forefront in the most brutal skirmishes. Menelaus, however, was no longer a man focused solely on winning. He had fought for so long, driven by pride, duty, and the hope of seeing Helen restored to him. But with each victory, the more he realized that nothing would ever truly be the same. In the chaos of the final battle, as the Greeks pressed forward, Menelaus's thoughts turned not to Helen, not to Troy, but to the warriors who had fallen at his side. Diomedes, Ajax, Patroclus, and countless others, men who had given their lives for the cause, had all died in the name of this senseless war. What would their deaths mean if they weren't part of a greater plan, Menelaus wondered. It was in the heat of the battle that Menelaus encountered Hector, the Trojan prince, who had already become a legend in his own right. Hector, though a fierce and noble warrior, was not the man he had once been. His own internal struggles mirrored Menelaus's. He had fought for the defence of his people, but at what cost? As the two men met on the battlefield for one final confrontation, Menelaus understood the true weight of their actions. Both of them were mere figures in the game of the gods, struggling to find meaning in a conflict they never truly controlled. Their battle was brief, but brutal. Menelaus fought with the fierce resolve of a man who had nothing left to lose, but Hector, though valiant, was exhausted from years of war. When the duel ended, Menelaus stood victorious, but he did not feel the elation he had once imagined would accompany such a victory. Instead, there was only a grim understanding that he had taken another man's life. And for what? For a war that seemed to have no end, for a wife whose value seemed less certain with each passing day. Is this worth it? Menelaus thought, his gaze falling on Hector's body. The answer was as unclear as it had ever been. Though the Greeks would eventually sack Troy and claim victory, The toll of the war had changed Menelaus forever. His internal battle, which had been raging throughout the conflict, had reached its climax. He had fought for honour, for love, for duty, but in the end it was the weight of the lives lost that haunted him most. As the gates of Troy fell and the spoils of victory were gathered, Menelaus found himself alone amidst the ruins. His brother Agamemnon, ever the ambitious leader, revelled in the victory. But Menelaus could not join in the celebration. He had won, yes, but at what cost? His wife, Helen, whom he had so desperately fought for, was now his, yet the joy of their reunion felt hollow. What had he truly achieved? The war was over. Troy had fallen and the Greeks had won, at least in the sense that they had captured the city, taken its treasures, and managed to return home. But the victory felt less like triumph and more like a heavy sigh. Menelaus, like many of the returning warriors, had paid the price for that victory, not just in the lives of comrades lost, but in the very nature of his soul. Helen, who had once been the source of his greatest love, was now the symbol of his greatest frustration. They were reunited, yes, but there was no joy in that reunion. Menelaus had fought for her, had endured the endless years of bloodshed and heartache, only to realize that in doing so, he had lost so much of himself. She was no longer the dazzling, unattainable beauty that had started the war. She was simply the woman he had once loved, now forever entwined with the cost of all that they had endured. As Menelaus and Helen sailed back to Sparta, the journey was silent. The royal couple, once the talk of every banquet and the subject of countless songs, now had little to say to each other. Menelaus, though happy to return to his kingdom, could not shake the feeling that the war had taken more than just his warriors. It had taken his peace of mind. Upon their return to Sparta, Menelaus was hailed as a hero, but he didn't feel like one. He was welcomed by his people, who celebrated the fall of Troy and the return of their king, but to Menelaus the cheers felt distant, hollow. Helen, though a reminder of the past, was also a constant reminder of the war's tragic cost. As much as he loved her, he now realized that her beauty and the war it caused were far less important than the peace he had lost along the way. As Menelaus tried to return to his royal duties, he found that he couldn't escape the weight of the war. It followed him like a shadow, and no amount of feasts, victories, or royal titles could free him from the burden of his memories. He found himself often staring out at the sea, wondering if there was anything left to achieve. The gods, who had played their part in the war, had moved on. But Menelaus was left to grapple with the questions that had plagued him from the moment the war had begun. What was the cost of his victory? Was it worth it to fight for Helen, to sacrifice so much, only to return to a kingdom that felt emptier than when he had left? The people of Sparta hailed him as a hero, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost something far more valuable than he had gained. His army had returned victorious, but his heart felt like it had been left behind on the battlefield. Years passed, and Menelaus ruled Sparta with the same fairness and skill that had marked his reign before the war. But the kingdom felt different. The glory of his military achievements had faded, and in its place was a quiet, gnawing melancholy. He had done what was expected of him. He had fought for his kingdom, his honour, and his wife. But in the end, what had he truly achieved? His kingdom was intact, but the price was steep. His people had celebrated the fall of Troy, but Menelaus knew that no amount of gold or glory could replace what he had lost. He had once been a king who sought glory through war, who believed that honour could be won with a sword. Now he realized that true peace would not be found on the battlefield. It would be found in understanding the sacrifices that had already been made, in reconciling with the past, and in accepting the things that could never be undone. In his final years, Menelaus was often found walking alone by the shores of Sparta, staring out at the horizon as if looking for something that had long since disappeared. The fire that had once burned so brightly in him had dimmed, and he began to understand that the legacy of a hero is not always built on the victories he wins, but on the peace he finds after the war. As for Helen, though their love remained, it was no longer the passionate, all-consuming force that had once driven them both. They had both changed, and the bond they shared was now one of the understanding, rather than idealization. Together they ruled Sparta, but it was a quiet reign, one that focused not on glory, but on the hard-won peace that had eluded them for so long. When Menelaus passed away, his legacy was not defined by his victory in the Trojan War, nor by the beauty of his wife, but by the quiet wisdom that he had gained over the years. His story was not one of unblemished triumph, but of a man who had learned that the price of war was not always worth the victory. As Menelaus's life began to draw to a close, the once celebrated king of Sparta found himself more concerned with the passage of time than with the wars that had once defined him. The Trojan War, the event that had shaped so much of his destiny, had been over for many years. Yet the shadows of its impact still lingered in his thoughts. The victories, the triumphs, and the heroism of the Greeks now seemed like distant memories, memories tinged with loss and regret. Menelaus was no longer the fiery young king who had rallied his men to victory. He had grown wiser with age, but the weight of his past decisions remained heavy on his heart. While his people revered him as a hero, and historians would later recount his deeds with admiration, Menelaus himself could never fully reconcile the toll the war had taken on him. Helen was at his side, but even the love they shared had been forever altered by the tragedy that had unfolded between them. Unlike many of the other Greek heroes whose tales ended in glorious final battles or divine ascension, Menelaus's story was a quiet one that was marked not by grand gestures, but by a quiet acceptance of his fate. He had fought for his kingdom, his wife, and his honour, but in the end it was peace that he sought most of all. As the years passed, Menelaus began to understand the true cost of war, not just in terms of lives lost or cities destroyed, but in the soul of the man who fought. He had given everything to a cause that, in the end, had seemed less important than the simple desire for peace. When he died, Menelaus was not mourned in the same way as other great heroes. There were no grand celebrations, no feasts to mark his passing. Instead, his death was met with a quiet reverence, a recognition that, in many ways, he had lived a life far more complicated than that of the typical hero. Menelaus was remembered as a man who had fought for his kingdom, for his wife, and for his honour, but also as a man who had learned the true meaning of the loss. His legacy was not one of triumph, but of understanding. He had lived through the fire of war and emerged on the other side, not with more glory, but with a deeper understanding of its futility. In the end, Menelaus's legacy was that of a man who had survived the Trojan War, not by slaying monsters or claiming ultimate victory, but by bearing the burden of leadership, by confronting his doubts, and by finding a path to peace in a world that seemed forever at war. He became a symbol, not of the unblemished hero, but of the warrior who had fought not just for victory, but for the understanding that peace was the true prize. As for Helen, she remained by his side in the years that followed. Their relationship, though complex and altered by the events of the war, was one of mutual understanding. Menelaus and Helen, both survivors of the same war, came to understand each other in a way that transcended love or betrayal. They had both been caught in the tides of fate, and had seen firsthand the devastating consequences of the gods' whims. Their final years together were spent not in glory, but in reflection, reflecting on what had been lost, but also on what they had gained. The story of Menelaus and Helen, as tragic and complicated as it was, would endure in the annals of myth. But it was no longer just a tale of a king who fought for his wife. It was a tale of a man who fought for peace, who lived through the destruction of everything he held dear, and who in the end came to understand that some battles, no matter how hard you fight, cannot be won by force alone. There's a saying in the ancient world that goes something like this: the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And if anyone embodied this idea in Greek mythology, it was Ajax the Lesser, a man of towering strength, endless pride, and a reputation as one of the fiercest warriors of the Trojan War. But, as we'll see, for all his might, Ajax the Lesser wasn't exactly the sharpest sword in the sheath. You see, Ajax wasn't just any warrior. No, he was big, physically imposing with the kind of muscles that could probably split a tree in half with a single punch. When he walked into a room, you'd probably notice him before anyone else. But as is often the case with people who stand out, Ajax wasn't just a man of impressive stature. He had an ego to match. Some of the other Greek heroes had earned their renown through cleverness, Odysseus, sheer will, Achilles, or in the case of Agamemnon by being the guy who insisted on having everyone call him king. But Ajax, well, Ajax had earned his name by being really good at hitting things. Now, to be fair, his size and strength were no small feat. Ajax the Lesser, unlike his more famous counterpart Ajax the Greater, was known for his incredible speed and agility on the battlefield. Where the other Ajax, the massive, nearly indestructible force, was a true physical powerhouse, the lesser Ajax was quick and nimble, able to dart around with an almost surprising grace for someone built like a walking mountain. He was the kind of guy who could dart into the heart of the battle, swing his sword a few times, and then dash out before anyone could even get a good look at his shiny armour. Unfortunately for him, this tendency to be a bit too quick for his own good often got him into situations he probably should have avoided. But it wasn't just his physical prowess that made Ajax the Lesser stand out. It was his moral compass, which for all his bravado, wasn't always pointing in the right direction. Like many heroes of the time, Ajax was caught in the whirlwind of Greek hubris, that nasty little trait where gods and men alike believe they're invincible, and that everything in life revolves around their own glory. Ajax's claim to fame really came with his role in the Trojan War, where he was a vital part of the Greek forces. He wasn't the leader, but he was definitely a key player in the whole "let's sack Troy" business. There was no way the Greeks could have taken the city without him. He was fast, skilled, and made sure that everyone knew it. In fact, Ajax had one particular gift. He was known for his ability to throw a spear with lethal precision, a skill that earned him quite the reputation on the battlefield. But his Achilles' heel, pardon the pun, was his overwhelming confidence. You know the type. The guy who thinks he's untouchable and consequently makes choices that aren't always the smartest. This, of course, leads him to the type of situations where even gods sit back and go, "Oh, this is going to be good." As far as Trojan War warriors went, Ajax the Lesser had one thing that most of the other Greek heroes lacked: speed. While Achilles would charge in, cutting down enemies with godlike fury, and Odysseus would craft elaborate schemes to outwit the Trojans, Ajax wasn't one for subtlety. He wasn't exactly the brains of the operation, but when it came to charging headfirst into battle, he was top-notch. And if you needed someone to spear a guy with extreme precision while making it look effortless, Ajax the Lesser was your man. At the outset of the war, Ajax the Lesser quickly became known for his quick, almost acrobatic style of combat. Where most of the other Greek warriors relied on brute force, Ajax used his agility and lightning-fast reflexes to wreak havoc. He had an uncanny ability to move through the ranks of the Trojans, darting in and out of battle like some kind of mythical pinball. His speed made him a difficult target, and he often took out enemies before they even realized he was there. However, Ajax's rise wasn't just about his speed or his deadly aim. Like most Greek heroes, he had his pride, and as his reputation grew, so did his ego. He quickly began to see himself as an indispensable member of the Greek forces. "Without Ajax, we're doomed," he would joke, or not so jokingly, with his fellow warriors. And to be fair, his deeds spoke for themselves. He was instrumental in several key battles, charging into the heart of the action and securing critical victories. He had a particular knack for going after the Trojans' weakened or unsuspecting soldiers, picking them off one by one with a level of efficiency that would make even the gods nod in approval. Yet there was something about Ajax's approach to war that irked some of the other warriors. He often seemed to think he was the reason the Greeks were winning. His lack of humility, paired with his desire for personal glory, didn't sit well with many of the other leaders, particularly Agamemnon, who had to deal with his own struggles to maintain control over the Greek forces. While Achilles could at least be reasoned with sometimes, Ajax the Lesser was all about proving his own worth, and he wasn't shy about reminding everyone around him of that fact. But in the thick of the battle, these petty quarrels took a backseat to one thing: getting the job done, and Ajax did that in spades. Whether it was breaking through Trojan defences or securing key positions in the siege of Troy, Ajax's speed and skill made him one of the more reliable warriors among the Greeks. He was particularly useful in raids, moving quickly under the cover of night to disrupt Trojan camps or steal supplies. His agility allowed him to operate almost like a ghost in the chaos of the war. His most notable contribution came during the death of Patroclus. When Achilles, stricken with grief and rage after the death of his dear friend, refused to fight, Ajax was one of the leaders who stepped up to lead the charge. His role during this pivotal moment was crucial. He helped rally the Greek forces to push back the Trojans and ultimately buy enough time for Achilles to re-enter the fight. Ajax's leadership and bravery in this moment were pivotal to the Greek effort, but it also set the stage for something far more disastrous: Ajax's pride. As he continued to prove himself in battle, Ajax became one of the war's most celebrated warriors, but it was his arrogance that would eventually lead to his downfall. With each victory, he believed more and more that he was invincible, that his name would be forever etched in the annals of Greek legend. And why not? He was quick, he was deadly, and in his mind, no Trojan was a match for his might. If there's one thing that the gods love, it's a good tragic irony. And when it came to Ajax the Lesser, they certainly weren't going to miss the chance to teach him a lesson. Ajax, for all his talent and pride, had grown so certain of his invincibility that he failed to realize one simple truth: the gods can be real party poopers when it comes to human pride. The turning point came after the Greeks had finally breached the walls of Troy, and the city was all but theirs. The Trojans, broken and desperate, were on the defensive, and victory was within reach. Ajax had fought valiantly throughout the war, and now, with the city falling, his ego was soaring to new heights. He felt invincible. He had done it all. He'd fought the hardest, led the charge, and had earned his glory. What more could a hero like him want? Surely he would be the one to claim the spoils of war and ensure his name would be remembered forever. Enter the spoils of war. Specifically the armour of Achilles. When Achilles was killed by Paris, it was clear that his armour would become a symbol of great prestige. It was more than just a set of armour. It was a divine relic, the very symbol of the might of the Greeks' greatest warrior. It was the ultimate prize. Whoever claimed it would forever be seen as the rightful heir to Achilles' glory. The Greeks, ever eager for spoils, decided that the armour would be awarded to either Odysseus or Ajax, two of the most important and respected warriors on their side. Now, Odysseus, though a brilliant tactician, was not known for his physical prowess. Ajax, on the other hand, was. He had all the qualities that seemed to make him the perfect candidate for the prize: strength, honour, and, let's be honest, his ego was so large that he probably thought the armour had his name engraved on it. But when the armour of Achilles was awarded, the decision did not go to Ajax. It went to Odysseus. Why? Because Odysseus had proven himself in a way that Ajax simply could not. While Ajax had charge after charge, Odysseus had won the favour of the gods with his cunning and wit. He had outsmarted the Trojans with the famous Trojan horse, proving that sometimes brains win over brawn. Ajax was furious. This wasn't just a slight to his honour, it was a public humiliation. The gods, in their divine wisdom, had chosen the cunning Odysseus over the mighty Ajax, and the news hit him like a sword to the chest. But Ajax wasn't one to take defeat quietly. His pride burned with fury, and he could not accept that the armour he thought was rightfully his would go to anyone else. Driven by rage and a sense of betrayal, Ajax the Lesser decided to take matters into his own hands. That night he snuck into the Greek camp, intent on killing Odysseus and reclaiming the armour for himself. His plan was simple. If he couldn't have the armour through honour, he would simply take it by force. But as he crept into the night, a strange thing happened. The gods, who had been watching his every move, decided to have a little fun at his expense. In a twist of divine irony, the gods made Ajax think he was attacking Odysseus's men. He went into a frenzy, slaying anyone he encountered, but not Odysseus. In fact, the men Ajax killed weren't Greek at all. They were his own comrades. His rage, his thirst for vengeance blinded him to the reality of his actions. By the time he realized what had happened, it was too late. He had killed the very soldiers he had fought beside. The next morning Ajax woke to the horrific realization of what he had done. He had betrayed his own people, all in the name of his misplaced pride. There was no going back from this. The honour he sought was now lost forever. No one could respect a man who had slaughtered his comrades out of sheer arrogance. Devastated and overwhelmed with guilt, Ajax the Lesser realized that his great fall had come not because of his strength, but because of his hubris, his refusal to accept that the gods had a hand in shaping his fate. Pride, the one thing he had always relied on, had become his undoing, and in that moment he knew that no matter how many battles he won, his legacy would now be forever stained by the deaths of his own men. After the bloodshed in the camp, Ajax the Lesser stood alone, surrounded by the ghosts of his actions. The great warrior who had once been feared and respected now found himself stripped of the very honour that had driven him. He had taken life, not in battle where he had always excelled, but in a blind fury fueled by his own ego. He had slain his own comrades, men who had fought alongside him through thick and thin. The weight of their deaths pressed down on him like a stone, and the reality of what he had done began to sink in. For the first time in his life, Ajax the Lesser felt the full weight of his pride, the same pride that had once propelled him to the front lines, that had made him the fearsome warrior he had been. But now his pride felt like an anchor, dragging him deeper into despair. He was no longer the hero who had struck terror into the hearts of the Trojans. He was the man who had murdered his own people in his quest for glory. His mind raced with a mix of regret, shame, and self-loathing. As the Greeks learned of Ajax's actions, the response was immediate and unforgiving. The warriors, who had once cheered his name on the battlefield, now turned away from him, their faces clouded with disbelief and anger. Achilles, even in his absence as he had already withdrawn from the war, had earned more respect than Ajax ever could at that moment. Ajax's name, once spoken with reverence, was now whispered with a sense of unease. He had become the very thing he had fought so hard to avoid, a disgrace. Even the gods who had watched the events unfold seemed to pass judgment on him. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, had always been a supporter of Ajax's bravery, but now she could not ignore the depths to which his pride had taken him. Zeus, the king of the gods, may have respected warriors like Ajax, but even he knew that pride could destroy the greatest heroes. As Ajax wandered the battlefield plagued by his conscience, he could hear the voices of his fallen comrades calling to him. They were not just the voices of the dead, they were the voices of his own guilt. "Why did you do it?" they seemed to ask. "Why did you kill us?" But Ajax did not have an answer. There was no justification for what he had done. The gods had given him no punishment because he had already given himself the greatest punishment of all. He had lost his honour. His pride had been his greatest weapon, but now it had turned against him, leaving him empty, hollow, and broken. The Greeks, in their judgment of him, decided that Ajax's actions could not go unpunished. The prize of the armour of Achilles, which he had fought so fiercely to claim, was ultimately awarded to Odysseus, and it was now a symbol of all Ajax had lost. In a final, desperate attempt to reclaim his honour, Ajax made a fateful decision. He would take his own life. In his mind, the only way to redeem himself was through death, a death that would wash away his guilt and restore the honour he had once held so dear. But as he prepared to end his life, something else began to stir in him, a moment of clarity. He realised that death, while it might cleanse his soul in the eyes of the gods, would not erase his mistakes. His pride, his arrogance, his fatal flaw. Those were things he could never undo. He could not take back the lives he had destroyed, and no matter how he ended his life, his legacy would be forever tainted. The war was over, Troy had fallen, but Ajax the Lesser had already lost. As Ajax the Lesser stood on the precipice of his fate, he could feel the weight of the entire Trojan War pressing down on him. His mind swirled with guilt, rage, and despair as he looked upon the battlefield that had once been a place of glory and honour. Now it felt like nothing more than a graveyard of his mistakes, a place where heroes had died for causes they believed in, and where Ajax himself had been consumed by the very pride that had once defined him. The gods had turned their eyes away from him, their favour no longer granted. Athena, who had once watched over his victories, now seemed to mock him, as though to say, "You brought this upon yourself, Ajax." His honour, the very thing he had fought for, was shattered beyond repair. His attempt to reclaim it by killing Odysseus and taking the armour of Achilles had backfired in the most catastrophic way possible. He had slaughtered his own men, and in the end his enemies were left untouched. He had been reduced from the mighty hero of Troy to a man who couldn't even stand in the light of his own glory. In a final fit of rage and confusion, Ajax made his way to a secluded spot near the Greek camp, his sword in hand. The gods, who had orchestrated so much of his downfall, had left him with no escape but his own death. His desire to regain his honour and prove his worth to the gods had turned into an obsession, and now he saw no way out. He knelt, gazing at the sword in his hands, reflecting on the men he had killed, his own brothers in arms, the soldiers who had followed him through countless battles. He had murdered them without thinking, driven by a sense of entitlement and pride. How could he face them now in the afterlife? In his madness, Ajax the Lesser believed that death was the only solution, that his end would bring the redemption he so desperately sought. But the gods, having watched his descent into folly, had one final twist in store for him. Just as he was about to strike the fatal blow, the goddess Athena, ever the trickster, intervened. She clouded Ajax's mind further, twisting his perceptions until he no longer saw the Greek warriors around him. Instead, he believed he was slaying his enemies. His sword crashed down again and again, but it wasn't the Trojans he killed, it was his own comrades, his brothers in arms who had returned victorious from Troy. When the madness cleared, Ajax found himself surrounded by the bodies of his fallen friends, men who had fought beside him in the siege of Troy. His own actions had destroyed them, and he was left standing among the wreckage of his pride and hubris. The realization hit him with the force of 1,000 ships. He had become the monster he had always feared. His soul, once driven by honor and glory, was now stained by the blood of the very men he had sworn to protect. And in the midst of his despair, Ajax realized there was only one thing left to do. With no hope left, Ajax fell on his sword, a death he believed would restore his honor. His body was found by the Greeks, and though there was mourning, it was tinged with guilt and shame, for Ajax had not died a hero's death. His end was the consequence of his unyielding pride, and though he had once been a warrior worthy of song, he was now a cautionary tale. The Greeks, despite their victory, could not forget the tragic figure of Ajax the Lesser, the hero who had been undone by his own pride and arrogance. In death, he became a symbol of the danger of hubris, a warning that even the greatest warriors could be broken by their own egos. When the Trojan War ended, and the Greeks sailed back to their homeland, the victorious warriors returned not as heroes, but as men burdened with the weight of the gods' games, the consequences of their own actions and the toll of a war that had claimed so many lives. Among them was Ajax the Lesser, whose death, though significant, was one that left behind more questions than answers. In the years following his tragic demise, the story of Ajax the Lesser became one that Greek mothers would whisper to their children, not as a tale of glory, but as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the mightiest warrior can be undone by their own arrogance. His name was spoken not in song, but in hushed tones, for his legacy was not the stuff of heroes. It was the legacy of a man who was far too full of himself to see the path that the gods had laid out for him. His tale was one of great promise, but also of great ruin. When word of his suicide reached Sparta, the reaction was one of sorrow, but also of profound discomfort. Menelaus, who had fought beside Ajax and watched him rise to glory on the battlefield, could not bring himself to mourn the man who had slaughtered his own comrades. Instead, he stood in silence, the weight of Ajax's actions hanging between them. How could the Greeks celebrate a man who had died so disgracefully? How could they honour a warrior who had killed his brothers in arms out of pride and vengeance? In his final moments, Ajax had hoped to restore his honour, to find redemption in death. But the gods, as they so often did, denied him that. His death did not purify him. It only deepened the stain of his arrogance. The divine punishment was not immediate, but it was felt in the legacy Ajax left behind. The gods had turned their backs on him, and his death only cemented their judgment. Athena, who had once favoured Ajax, could not help but shake her head at his fate. She had seen it all unfold, the warrior's rise, his arrogance, his blind rage. She had watched as he thought himself invincible, only to fall prey to the very flaw that had undone so many before him. Hubris, the pride that led mortals to believe they could control their own fate, was Ajax's true downfall. Such is the price of hubris, Athena would say, though no one was left to listen. Yet despite his tragic end, Ajax the Lesser was not forgotten entirely. His name would still be remembered, but not in the same way as heroes like Achilles or Odysseus. He was not remembered for his brilliance in battle, but for the humbling lesson he left behind. His was a legacy not of triumph, but of tragic wisdom. He had been the victim of his own pride, and in his fall the Greeks learned that even the greatest warriors could be undone by the very flaw that made them great. As for Helen, who had once been the spark of the war and the cause of so much bloodshed, she lived on with Menelaus in Sparta. Their reunion, though tainted by the war, was one of quiet reflection. Menelaus, who had seen firsthand the cost of pride and loss, did not speak of Ajax often, but he did not forget him. He understood that in war there were no true victors, only those who survived the chaos and those who succumbed to it. Ajax's legacy was not one of glory. It was a lesson, and a painful one at that. His life and death served as a warning to the Greeks, reminding them that no matter how strong or skilled they were, the gods could turn on them at any moment. Ajax the Lesser would be remembered not as the mighty hero of Troy, but as the tragic figure who learned too late that pride comes before the fall, and that even the most powerful warrior can be brought low by his own arrogance. Though the Trojan War had ended, Ajax the Lesser's legacy continued to ripple through the annals of Greek myth. His tale was one of caution, a grim reminder that no matter how strong, swift or skilled a man may be, the gods always have the final word. For the warriors who followed in his wake, the story of Ajax was one they would hear often, not as a tale of heroic triumph, but as a tragic lesson about the dangers of unchecked pride. In the years following his death, the Greeks would remember Ajax not for his victories, but for the bitter consequences of his arrogance. His story became a cornerstone of their understanding of hubris, the belief that mortals could stand equal to the gods. Ajax the Lesser had thought himself untouchable, and in doing so he had sealed his fate. His story was told by bards in the great halls of Greece, not as a tale of glory, but as a warning to the next generation of warriors. Pride, the bards would say, is a fire that burns brightest in the strongest warriors, and the gods will not let it go unchecked. But Ajax's legacy was not just one of doom. The Greeks recognized that, like all heroes, his story was complex, a mixture of bravery, recklessness and tragic flaws. His courage in battle had been undeniable. His quick thinking on the battlefield had saved many Greek lives, and his actions during the Trojan War were not to be forgotten. Ajax the Lesser had been a hero in his own right, fierce, unyielding and determined. Yet his fatal flaw, his inability to reconcile with the gods and his overwhelming desire for personal glory, had led him to a tragic end. Even Helen, who had been at the heart of the war, and who had witnessed the effects of Ajax's pride firsthand, carried a heavy heart as she reflected on the cost of it all. After all, it was her beauty, which had sparked the war, that had brought all these heroes to Troy. She lived with the knowledge that her actions, though never intended to start a war, had led to the downfall of so many men, and Ajax, in many ways, had been one of the greatest of these tragic figures. While she was with Menelaus, her thoughts often turned to the men who had fallen and the sacrifices they had made, Ajax included. His pride, in her eyes, had taken him from a hero to a cautionary tale. The great warrior who once charged into battle with the fury of a lion had ended his life with the futility of a man who could not accept his own flaws. For those who came after Ajax, his story remained a solemn reminder of the dangers of hubris. The Greeks, who had always revered their heroes, understood that greatness came not just from victory, but from the ability to accept one's limitations. The story of Ajax the Lesser was woven into their culture as both a symbol of what could be achieved and a warning of what could be lost. No one was immune from the gods' judgment, and even the mightiest heroes could fall. In the grand tapestry of Greek mythology, where the gods were as capricious as they were powerful, Ajax the Lesser would be remembered as one of the tragic figures whose actions were shaped by their inner demons. His pride may have propelled him to greatness, but it was his downfall that truly defined him. Ajax's legacy was not written in the blood of the Trojans he killed, or the victories he claimed, but in the lesson he left behind. Even the greatest heroes must remain humble before the gods, for it is pride that leads to a hero's ultimate fall. In the land of Argos, there were many heroes with extraordinary talents. Some had the strength of lions, others had the brains of, well, Odysseus, who could outwit the gods before breakfast. But then there was Lynceus, whose special gift was one that could make even the gods raise an eyebrow. He could see through walls. Yes, you heard that right. Walls. Now, while most mortals had to rely on their strength, wit, or occasionally their charm, which, let's be honest, was pretty much just golden armour and a winning smile, Lynceus was blessed with the ability to see everything. Not only could he peer through walls like a human X-ray machine, but he could also get a glimpse into the hearts of men, see hidden dangers, and even peek into the future, though sometimes he wished the future had a spoiler alert feature. Growing up, Lynceus's gift wasn't always the blessing it seemed. Sure, he could spot trouble coming from miles away, but he also had the disadvantage of seeing things he wasn't supposed to see, like when his neighbour, Pythagoras, was stealing a second helping of dinner, and when Jason was trying to sneak a glance at his sister Alcmene while she was doing laundry. "I saw that," he'd say, and suddenly the awkwardness would hang in the air like a bad smell. The real challenge, though, came when Lynceus realised that this ability to see through things wasn't just about spying on neighbours or detecting thieves. He could also see his own future, and let's just say, it wasn't all golden fleece and happy endings. In fact, sometimes seeing the future felt a little like binge-watching a drama, where every episode ends with a cliffhanger. "Great, now I know how this ends," he'd grumble, realising that some surprises are better left unseen. But no one said being a hero was easy. So, when Jason, the leader of the Argonauts, came calling for brave men to join him in the quest for the Golden Fleece, Lynceus figured, why not? After all, he could see through the walls of Troy and the minds of his fellow Argonauts, and probably avoid most of the monsters and traps along the way. What's the worst that could happen, he thought. Spoiler alert, things were about to get much, much more complicated. As Lynceus set off with the Argonauts on their legendary quest for the Golden Fleece, he was filled with excitement, mostly about the idea of a big adventure, a cool team of heroes, and of course the chance to avoid looking at anyone's secrets for a while. After all, when you've spent your entire life knowing a little too much about everyone around you, a quest with monsters and magical artifacts sounded like the perfect distraction. Jason, the leader of the Argonauts, had a reputation for being a brilliant strategist. However, even the best of strategists could use someone who could see through solid rock or into the hearts of their enemies, so Lynceus was brought along not just as a warrior, but as a valuable asset. With his ability to literally see through things, he became the unofficial spy of the group, a perfect role for someone who had already spent years peering into the personal lives of the townsfolk. Their journey naturally was filled with its fair share of divine interference, as all Greek quests seemed to be. Along the way, Lynceus found himself not just fighting monsters, but also looking into the future, which, as it turned out, wasn't always the most fun experience. Imagine knowing that in a few days you'll have to face a horrible creature, but there's no way to avoid it. "Ugh, I saw this coming," he would mutter under his breath as he saw yet another perilous situation unfold. But then, just when Lynceus was starting to think he might be able to do some good in this quest without too many divine headaches, they hit the Bosphorus, where they were faced with the clashing rocks. Now, Jason had a plan. He was good at that. But Lynceus saw the whole thing coming, literally. The rocks, which would smash the ship if not navigated properly, were not an easy thing to get around, especially when their movement was so unpredictable. But Lynceus, with his ability to see through solid objects, and his ability to see things coming before they did, immediately told Jason exactly what they needed to do. "I see them moving in a pattern," Lynceus declared, squinting at the massive rocks that looked like they were ready to crush them. "We'll need to steer right through the middle when they're apart." Jason, who trusted Lynceus's instincts, nodded and immediately made the call. They navigated through the massive rocks with the precision of a well-trained fleet, all thanks to Lynceus's foresight. The ship passed through safely, with the clashing rocks smacking together behind them like two bouncers at a club who had just been given a VIP pass to watch the chaos unfold. "See, I told you I could get us through this," Lynceus said with a grin, trying to ignore the muttered complaints from the other Argonauts, who were all too happy to not have to face those crushing rocks. But while his ability to see the future, and especially his sharp sight through walls and rock, was a great asset, it did have some unexpected drawbacks. There were moments during the journey when Lynceus could see things he really didn't want to see, like the fact that Heracles would snap yet another bowstring, or that Orpheus's singing would soon get on everyone's nerves. Even worse, he'd occasionally see things about the other heroes' love lives, which was an uncomfortable experience, especially when it involved Atalanta, who was just a tad too good at hiding her crush on Jason. "Couldn't you, I don't know, not look at that stuff?" Orpheus asked one day, catching Lynceus staring off into the distance with a dazed look. "I'm just trying to tune out a bit here with my music, and you're over there staring at my, well, you know." "I can't help it," Lynceus sighed. "I was just born this way, all right? I can't unsee things." Despite these awkward moments, Lynceus's ability to help navigate the journey, whether through predicting dangers or keeping an eye on the changing tides of fate, proved essential. It wasn't long before Jason came to realize that he had more than just a skilled fighter in Lynceus. He had an invaluable ally who could foresee the obstacles ahead. That wasn't to say the journey was without its challenges, but with Lynceus on the team, the Argonauts were certainly better equipped to face them. By the time the Argonauts had reached the land of Colchis, where the Golden Fleece was said to be guarded by fierce creatures and gods, Lynceus had become an invaluable part of the team. He had helped navigate past countless dangers, avoided deadly traps, and offered wisdom that only someone with his unique abilities could provide. But as the quest grew more perilous, Lynceus found that his gift wasn't always as much of an advantage as he thought. The more he could see, the more he realized how much he couldn't control. The gods, ever fickle and always meddling, began to play their part in this chapter of the Argonauts' adventure. Aphrodite, for example, decided that she had a little too much free time on her hands and took it upon herself to test the strength of the heroes' relationships, especially Jason's and Medea's. Now, it's one thing to be able to see through the wall of a cave or into an enemy's camp, but it's another entirely to see someone's deep secret thoughts and desires. Lynceus, who had always been the kind of guy to mind his own business, mostly because, he had no choice, suddenly found himself overwhelmed by what he was seeing. Not just the god schemes, but the complex relationships that were brewing among the Argonauts. For example, one morning as the crew gathered for their usual breakfast, which was mostly dry fish and stale bread, Lynceus glanced over at Jason, who had been staring at Medea with an almost dangerous intensity. He didn't need to see through any walls for this. He could see the tension in the air and the silent conversations happening between the two of them. His vision flared with images, Medea, Jason, and the consequences of their decisions, and it was enough to make Lynceus uncomfortable. "This is just great," Lynceus muttered to himself as he turned away. "I can't even have a peaceful breakfast without seeing everyone's emotional baggage. What's next? Am I going to see Orpheus's love life in Technicolor? Oh wait, I already have." But Lynceus knew that it wasn't just about watching things unfold. It was about the moral weight of knowing things before they happened, seeing what others couldn't see. His ability to look into people's hearts, to read their desires and fears, made him feel like he had a responsibility to act. And sometimes that was more of a burden than a gift. What if he saw something about Medea or Jason that no one else knew? What if he saw that the Golden Fleece wasn't worth the cost? Should he intervene or just let things play out? One night, as the Argonauts camped near the edge of the forest, Lynceus found himself at a crossroads. The Golden Fleece, which had seemed like the ultimate prize, was now surrounded by layers of complication. The dangerous creatures guarding it, the divine interference from the gods, and the moral dilemmas that haunted him made Lynceus wonder if this quest was ever truly about heroism, or if it was all just the gods' plaything. His visions had grown more vivid. He saw the dangers ahead, but he also saw the temptations that each of them would face. He saw Jason's ambition, Medea's loyalty, and Hercules' loneliness. Lynceus knew that the quest was testing each one of them in ways they hadn't imagined, and it was at that moment, standing alone beneath the stars, that Lynceus finally understood something that no one else had. The quest for the Golden Fleece wasn't about the fleece at all. It was about the choices they made and how those choices would shape their futures. "I see it all," Lynceus whispered to himself, "but can I change it?" He realized that his gift, his extraordinary ability to see into the future, wasn't the blessing he'd always thought it to be. Sure, he could avoid dangers, predict outcomes and win battles, but he couldn't control the consequences of the decisions they made, nor could he shield himself from the truth of those decisions. Fate wasn't just about knowing what would happen. It was about accepting that some things were beyond even a hero's power to change. The turning point in Lynceus's journey had arrived. His vision was a gift, yes, but it was also a curse. He could see the future and all the threads that connected the choices they made, but in the end it was up to him and everyone else to decide how to move forward. As the Argonauts closed in on the Golden Fleece, Lynceus knew one thing for certain. His true challenge was not in seeing the future, but in accepting that he couldn't control it. As the Argonauts neared the final stretch of their journey to Colchis, the anticipation among the crew grew palpable. The Golden Fleece, the object of their entire quest, was within reach. Yet, Lynceus found himself strangely detached from the excitement of it all. His ability to see through walls, his gift to know the future, it had all become too much. It wasn't just about avoiding traps or predicting outcomes anymore. Now he could see the true cost of their pursuit, and as the days passed, the visions grew more unsettling. It wasn't just the fleece he saw, it was the aftermath. The consequences of their choices weighed heavily on his mind, and what he had once thought was an honour, being part of this group of heroes, now felt more like a burden. One evening, as the Argonauts gathered around a campfire, Lynceus sat apart, watching the flames flicker and dance. His mind was not on the conversation about strategy or the treasure they sought, but on the moral toll this quest was taking on them all. Jason, who had once seemed so certain of his role as the leader, now seemed driven by something darker. His ambition had become all-consuming. Medea, though loyal, had her own internal struggles that Lynceus could see with painful clarity. Hercules had always been a force of nature, but Lynceus saw the loneliness in his heart, the quiet desperation for something more than just physical strength. And then there was Lynceus himself. His gift, which he had once thought of as a blessing, now felt like a curse. He could see what the gods had planned, but he was powerless to stop it. He could see the pain that would come from the decisions they made, the struggles they would endure, and he knew that, in the end, the Golden Fleece might not bring them the peace they sought. "Why are we really doing this?" he asked himself, his voice barely a whisper in the cool night air. He was tired of fighting for glory, tired of being a pawn in the gods' game. In a quiet moment, Medea approached him. She had noticed the distant look in his eyes, the weight he carried in his heart. "You've been quiet," she said softly, sitting beside him. "What's troubling you?" Lynceus didn't look at her immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the fire. "I can see the end of this, Medea," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "I see the price we'll pay for this fleece. The gods have already decided what will happen to us. We can't escape it." Medea's eyes softened with understanding. "You can see the future," she said, her voice barely audible. "But that doesn't mean you're bound to it. It doesn't mean that we can't change it." But Lynceus wasn't so sure. He had always believed that his ability to see the future would make him unstoppable. He had felt invincible, like he could predict every obstacle, avoid every disaster. But now, as they neared the fleece, the truth settled in. No matter what he saw, he couldn't change it. The very idea of fate, that his vision of the future might not be as flexible as he had once thought, was a bitter pill to swallow. In his heart he wanted to believe that the future wasn't set in stone, that his choices mattered. But the more he saw, the more he realized that the threads of fate were woven by forces much greater than him. As the quest to claim the Golden Fleece took its final steps, Lynceus knew that he had to make a choice. Would he continue down this path, accepting that the gods had their plans for him and his companions, or would he defy them in the only way he could, by accepting his limitations? The decision wasn't easy, but after long nights of restless thought, Lynceus came to a realization. True heroism wasn't about controlling the future or bending fate to your will. It was about accepting that the future was unknown and embracing the uncertainty. Perhaps his gift of seeing things that others couldn't was more about understanding his own role in the world and accepting the consequences of his actions, rather than trying to change what had already been set in motion. The final leg of the journey to Colchis had arrived, and the tension among the Argonauts was palpable. They were nearing the Golden Fleece, the object of their long and arduous quest, and their fate seemed almost sealed. Lynceus, who had seen so much over the course of the journey, felt the weight of the moment more heavily than anyone else. His ability to see into the future, to witness the unravelling of events before they happened, had never been more agonizing. He could see the outcomes of their actions, but he was powerless to change them. In the heart of Colchis, where the fleece was guarded by the dragon of Ares, the Argonauts faced their final test. Jason and Medea, with their connection growing stronger, knew that the gods had a hand in everything they did. But Lynceus, with his unparalleled gift of sight, saw beyond the physical threats. He saw the emotional toll the journey had taken on them, the internal conflicts, the tensions between Jason and Medea. The unspoken jealousies that had begun to arise among the group were now as much a part of the quest as the dragon guarding the fleece. When they arrived at the gates of the temple, Lynceus felt the fate of each Argonaut as if it were his own. He could see how the fleece would shape them all, how it would either fulfill their dreams or shatter them entirely. But the future, he knew, was not something he could control. The gods had already decided the path for these mortals, and he was simply a spectator, however gifted, unable to stop the course of events. On the night before the final battle to retrieve the Golden Fleece, Lynceus stood at the edge of the camp looking out at the river that wound its way through the heart of Colchis. The stars twinkled above, but for him they were like distant memories, beautiful but out of reach. He didn't know how much of his future had already been written. He felt the pull of fate, the invisible force that had guided them this far, and wondered if there was still room for choice. As he stared out into the night, Medea approached him, her footsteps light but purposeful. "You've been quiet," she said softly, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding of what Lynceus was feeling. She could sense his internal conflict, his frustration with his own abilities, and his weariness from constantly knowing what was coming. "I see it all, Medea," Lynceus replied, turning toward her. "I see the danger. I see the choices we're making, but it doesn't matter. The gods have already written it. We're just playing our parts." He paused, his voice heavy with the burden of knowledge. "I can't change what's already been decided, but I'll do my part." Medea's gaze softened. "None of us can change the gods, but that doesn't mean we don't have choices. You don't have to let your gift define you, Lynceus. You can still act, even if the future is already laid out before you. We're not bound by the gods unless we choose to be." Her words hung in the air like a lifeline, pulling him back from the edge of his own despair. He could see the future, but she was right. He didn't have to let it trap him. The power of his sight could guide them, but it did not have to control him. It was in this moment that Lynceus made his decision. He would no longer be a passive spectator to his fate. He would embrace his role in the story, not as a man who could predict the future, but as a man who could shape his own choices even within the constraints of destiny. The next day, the Argonauts marched toward the Temple of Ares, the final confrontation with the dragon and the Golden Fleece awaiting them. Lynceus, with his new understanding, moved with a sense of resolve. He knew that whatever happened, whether they succeeded or failed, the quest for the fleece was not the end of their journey. It was a stepping stone, and he would face whatever came with courage. Jason, Medea, Heracles, Orpheus, and the rest of the Argonauts braced for battle. As Lynceus stood among them, he could see the threads of fate weave their way through the group, but this time he no longer feared what was to come. They were all bound together, and together they would face whatever the gods had in store. In the end, it was Medea who used her magic to subdue the dragon, and it was Jason who claimed the Golden Fleece. But Lynceus, for his part, had played his role, guiding the team through the temple's traps, offering wisdom when it was needed most, and standing firm as a reminder that sometimes the journey mattered more than the destination. When the Argonauts finally returned from their arduous quest for the Golden Fleece, they were hailed as heroes. Songs were written, tales were told, and the fleece was paraded as the symbol of their collective triumph. Jason, though weary from the journey, stood as the leader of the greatest band of heroes Greece had ever seen, and Medea, by his side, became a legend in her own right. Yet for Lynceus, whose gift of foresight had been both a blessing and a curse, the journey had left a deeper mark than just the physical scars of battle. In many ways, Lynceus's greatest victory was not the Golden Fleece itself, nor his role in helping the Argonauts achieve their goal. It was the quiet realization that his true strength was not in his ability to see through walls or glimpse into the future. It was in his ability to accept his limitations and choose how to act within the constraints of fate. He had long been haunted by the thought that if he could see the future, he should be able to control it. But over time, Lynceus learned that even the most gifted heroes had to accept that some things were beyond their grasp. As the Argonauts celebrated their return, Lynceus couldn't fully join in the jubilation. He was happy to see his comrades succeed, but the questions that had haunted him throughout the journey lingered. Was he truly a hero? What had he really accomplished beyond simply knowing what was going to happen? His gift had been invaluable, but at times it felt more like a prison than a power. The truth he realized was that no hero could escape fate, no matter how much they could see it coming. Even the gods could not change their own fate, much less the future of mortals. When the heroes of the quest parted ways, Lynceus returned to Argos, his home, carrying with him the weight of his knowledge and his gift. The people there had once looked at him as a hero, but now, as time passed, Lynceus found that he could not escape the sense that he was forever haunted by the truths he had seen. His relationships with his fellow mortals became strained, How could he connect with them when he saw their deepest secrets? And even more painful was the distance between him and Marpessa, whom he had once fought so hard to win and keep. Though they had shared a love, it was difficult for him to share anything else with her, knowing what he knew. The burden of his gift was too great, and it began to weigh on their relationship, leaving them both emotionally distant. But Lynceus did not let the burden of his gift break him. His legacy, as it would turn out, was more about his acceptance of fate than his ability to change it. He lived the rest of his life as a reminder to the heroes who would follow that no matter how much you can see, no matter how much you know, true heroism comes from acting with courage in the face of uncertainty, knowing that not everything is within your control. In the end, Lynceus's story was not one of great glory, but rather a story of quiet wisdom. He became a figure remembered for his self-awareness, a hero who had the power to see the future, but who chose to live with humility and accept his limitations. His name would not be sung by bards with the same fervour as Heracles or Achilles, but in the hearts of those who knew him, his story carried the truth that heroes are not defined by their ability to conquer fate, but by how they face it, even when they see the storm coming. After the legendary quest for the Golden Fleece had ended, the heroes of the Argonauts went their separate ways, each with their own share of glory or regret. Some would die young, others would achieve greatness beyond the shores of Greece, and some, like Lynceus, would fade into myth. Remembered not for their physical feats, but for their unique place in the great tapestry of Greek legend. Lynceus's story was not one of grand battles or divine victories. He did not return from the quest with trophies or accolades. Instead, his legacy was shaped by the quiet lessons he learned along the way. He was not remembered for defeating gods or monsters, but for how he learned to navigate the immense burden of his ability, the gift that allowed him to see what others could not. It was a gift that made him invaluable to the Argonauts, but also one that isolated him, for how could he ever truly be understood by those around him? Lynceus's vision, both literal and metaphorical, revealed more than any man should ever have to see. But it wasn't just the burden of his powers that shaped his legacy. It was his growth as a person. He started his journey thinking that knowing the future would make him invincible, but he ended it realizing that the true measure of a hero wasn't about controlling fate. It was about accepting it. Lynceus became a figure who understood that no matter how much you could foresee, you could never control the outcome. His decision to accept the limits of his abilities, to stop trying to control his fate, is what ultimately elevated his story to one of wisdom rather than sheer adventure. The Argonauts, as a group, were remembered for their bravery, for overcoming the trial set before them by both mortals and gods. Yet, Lynceus's place in their story was more quiet, more introspective. His greatest contribution wasn't in the way he fought or the number of enemies he felled, but in the way he served as a mirror to the other heroes, showing them that strength alone wouldn't define them, but rather how they dealt with the uncertainty that awaited them at every turn. Medea, who had seen so much of Lynceus's struggles, often thought of him in the years after the quest had ended. In her quiet moments, when she reflected on the challenges of her own fate, she remembered how Lynceus had struggled with his own knowledge of the future, how his gift had both burdened and protected him. She understood, perhaps more than anyone, the weight of knowing too much, and how it could distort a person's sense of self. Lynceus's acceptance of the limitations of his gift became an example to her, and in some ways it helped her find peace with her own role in the gods' endless games. In Messenia, where Lynceus had once been celebrated as the son of a noble house, the people continued to tell stories of the mighty Argonauts. Lynceus's name was mentioned among those of the great warriors, but he was not spoken of with the same fanfare as Jason or Heracles. Rather, he was remembered as a man of insight, whose true heroism lay not in his physical feats, but in his wisdom, the wisdom to understand that knowing the future was not the same as controlling it. His gift, which had once been a source of pride and strength, became a symbol of the humility that all heroes, mortal or divine, must come to understand. In the annals of Greek mythology, where heroes' stories are often told in bold strokes of valour, Lynceus's tale stands as a quiet testament to the power of acceptance. His strength was never in his ability to predict the future, but in his ability to face it with the understanding that no matter how hard he tried, he could never change what was already meant to be. As for the Golden Fleece, it remained a symbol of divine will, a reminder that even the greatest heroes are merely pawns in the gods' eternal games. Yet, the heroes who sought it out, like Lynceus, left behind their own stories, filled with moments of pride and humility. For some, like Jason, the fleece was a symbol of triumph. For others, like Lynceus, it became a symbol of the acceptance of things beyond one's control.